All right. Well, here we are with the podcast, A Lesson Before Writing, episode 12, which means that next month will be our 1 year anniversary. We'll have to think about doing something special, maybe wear party hats or something. But I'm Ted Morrison. I'm here with my co hosts, including Grant Tracy, and this is Grant's most recent release by us, Neon Kiss. And just within the last month or so out in Kindle edition, but it's available in hardcover and paperback. And the paperback, like the Kindle edition, has both the terrific introduction that Grant wrote and also a preview of the new Hayden Fuller mystery, A Shoeshine Kill. So that's very cool. And then here also with Brady Harrison, and this is Brady's story collection, The Turn Between, winner of the High Plains Book Award. But we are working on Brady's novel, and I finally have the whole darn thing typeset. So I trust Brady is furiously proofreading the pages, and I want to talk to you about the cover during the podcast. So be looking forward to that. And then this is my most recent book, The Strophes of Job. And I've been very gratified. It's a novel. It's a prequel to my novel, Crow Song for the Stricken. And it's been getting, really generous reviews, which I'm again, very grateful for. And in fact, Kirkus Reviews, the editors let me know that they're going to include the review in the print journal of Kirkus Reviews in July. And apparently only about 25% of the books are chosen for that. So that's pretty cool. And consequently, I'm working feverishly to get a paperback edition of the book out for July. So anybody who reads that review, if they're so inclined, they probably be more inclined to purchase the paperback than the hardcover edition. But there's going to be a bunch of bonus stuff in the paperback, so I'm looking forward to that. All right, so as our dedicated listeners know, viewers, listeners, we'll kick around some topics here, and then ultimately we've got a featured story we're going to talk about, and it's a little bit different this month than what we normally have done, but obviously I'll explain more about that a little later. We have a couple of things that we might want to sort of start off with, and I'll kind of make a little announcement and then segue into one of them. I mentioned last podcast that I had been circulating these little bits and pieces of this speculative fiction thing I'd been working on and kind of set it aside, but I'd extracted some smaller pieces to send around, and one of them had been picked up and published by Caustic Frolic, and that came out in the interim. Well, just a couple of days ago, I was contacted by Sci-Fansat. I always have to think about Sci-Fansat e-zine, and they've picked up another piece called In Our Town, or In Our Time. It's actually a play on Hemingway's first short story collection, and that's going to be coming out this weekend. Suddenly I feel like Kilgore Trout. I've never been much of a sci-fi guy, and suddenly I feel like this kind of underground sci-fi writer. I've got to grow a big beard and live as a recluse or something. But I want to throw that out partly to give a shout out to those journals. But again, one of the topics that Brady has brought up in particular is we have more ideas that we want to do, more books we want to write, more articles, more stories, more poems, more whatever, than we have time for. And that part can be kind of frustrating. So like, for example, I mentioned it because, again, I spent a year on this sci-fi novel, wasn't kind of sure where it was going. So I set it aside and I started this new novel, which is the complete opposite. It's more my normal fare. It's set in like 1850 London. I've got about 20,000 words into that. But I'm also chipping away on this translation of the poem Beowulf. So the plan is Monday through Thursday, I work on the new novel. Friday, I work on my Beowulf translation. But I also am writing critical articles. I want to get back to writing some sonnets. There's just too much to do. Not enough time and too much stuff we want to write. So Brady, since you had thrown that topic out there, what are some of your thoughts on that conundrum?
Oh, well. I have so many thoughts, and first things first, Ted. I don't know how you do it. Not to be thinking about you behind your back, but I've been thinking about the Beowulf project and thinking about the fiction and thinking about your criticism and that guy behind you the picture over your shoulder. And
Master William Gass.
yeah, that guy. And then thinking too about the Finnegan's Wake reading group that you've been running. And I'm always struck by, and I think about Grant in the same context, like in the plays, directing plays, acting, writing, teaching. So this phenomenon of the super busyness, and then how to find time for all the different projects and all the different ideas, because of course there's so many things that interest us. And so this is a shameless self-promotion, but a friend, a mutual friend of Grant and mine, Barry Falk, and I just had our second co-edited collection reach the final production stages with Bloomsbury. Our first collection was on Joe Strummer. This one's on Bob Dylan. And so already I have ideas, because if you're going to do 2 books, you might as well do a trilogy. And then this harkens back, and I'll stop nattering here, and I'm just wandering all over the place because we have so many different ideas and interested in so many different things. In our last podcast was talking about a story that I've been circulating and I quite like, but I had 2 endings in mind, and I chose the wrong one, I think. And so I've been rewriting that story. And then I have a new longer work that I've begun. And so to wrap all this up, how in all of those things that we're interested in, all the books we want to read and all the work that we want to write, how do we choose? And so I've been thinking a lot about that in the last couple of weeks. And so I'm curious what you guys will say. But for my own part, and it maybe connects even to this story, like we're kind of getting a little older. And so I'm thinking like we have to be really careful about what we choose to put our time into. Like we don't want to be too rigorous or too stringent about that. We want to, let our minds be limber and be free. But at the same time, I do feel now some pressure to be a little more calculating in my choices about the kind of work. And I have to really feel passionate. Like in the old days, it used to be enough. Like, I think that's a pretty interesting idea. I wonder where that will go. That would be enough. But now, got to be selective. So I'll kick it over to Grant.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. As I've got older, I've streamlined, or at least I just keep thinking everything connects, rather than it being all disparate. But like early in my career, I was a film scholar and a creative writer, and eventually I had to shift my portfolio to largely writing, short stories and working on novels and that sort of thing. And although I've kept up with film scholarship and read new books that come out, because I teach film classes, I haven't really written anything in probably 10 years in that area. And do I miss it? Yeah, but my passions and my energies have been driven to writing fiction of crime fiction. And I think I start justifying it, like I start to see everything through that lens. I remember when I was doing my dissertation, all I could think about was James Cagney, because that's what my dissertation was on. So when people would ask me, I would see all the world through James Cagney and star study, because that's what the Richard Dyer approach to looking at stars as a multiplicity of signs and meanings. And eventually I've just kind of narrowed down to like the acting stuff all fits into being present when you're with other performers. And then I feel I'm more present when I'm writing, present with my characters in my stories, more engaged, more connected. So the acting works that way. In my spare time, I'm constantly reading crime books. I've read like 3 Perry Mason novels this summer, and I've read 3 Earl Stanley Gardner's 3 George Simenon McGray novels. I just finished a novel by the Gordons called The FBI Story, which has their character Ripley, not to be confused with Patricia Highsmith. But anyway, so I feel like the crime stuff I read feeds into my crime writing. Although I do read literary fiction too. I mean, obviously for North American Review, but also because I want to, work on my chops. I don't want to get too enamored with a certain style of writing. But I like that narrowing down of like, if it doesn't fit in to my larger agenda, what I want to do, I'm not putting the time in. But directing plays, I can connect to writing. Acting in plays, I can connect to writing. Reading crime, I can connect to writing. Working with students on theses. So I've been very fortunate with the job I have to be able to structure my portfolio in such a way that I don't feel like I'm doing things that are detracting from my career as a writer. It all works. Being an editor, working with other writers, yeah, it's a blessing for me. So I don't have any complaints, but I just know early in my career there was a regret. And I'll tell one more story and I'll shut the hell up. But I had this dream, and I've probably shared this with you guys like 20 years ago, I think it was. And it was right around the time I was making a decision to let film scholarship go. But James Cagney was because he was such a part of my life from like about 1990 to, whatever, 2008, whatever. And he was 1930s James Cagney. He had the hat and a gun, and he looked over at me and smiled. And then he just walked down this long hallway, and I heard his footsteps. I saw him, and then he was gone. And I think it was his way of giving me permission to let that part of my life go. I kind of believe in the power of dreams. I don't know if it's mystical, whatever. But the interesting thing is that then I brought him back for 2 short stories I wrote. He became like James Cagney in a couple of short stories. So I was able to sort of use my film scholarship in my creative writing, or I write sometimes about actors, or I write about people who write about movies. So it all fits, I think. But it was tough. I spent so much part of my life being a film guy, and I still watch a lot of movies, a lot of TV shows. And right now I'm working through the 2nd season of Star Trek. What a tremendous show. But anyway, I watched the one with the guy from Mod Squad last night, Something's Child, Tomorrow's Child, Yesterday's Child. It was a great episode. But anyway, so that's my opinion on that, is find ways to make it work if that's what you want to be doing. And if it doesn't, let some of those other activities go, if you're fortunate enough to be able to do so. I mean, if you're a bus driver, you got to go drive your bus, but you're meeting a lot of people, and then you can make that part of the story building world, these personalities and stuff, or maybe tell some stories about bus drivers, so yeah.
Yeah, that's all really fascinating. I agree wholeheartedly that even someone at a distance who maybe looks at my CV or something might say, like, this guy is all over the place. He's focused on novel writing. He's doing these short stories. He's doing these poems. He's doing Beowulf scholarship. He's doing William Gass scholarship. He's got some sort of disease or something. He needs to take some medicine and get fucked. But I really do feel like they're all a constellation of a similar kind of thing, and they do all kind of feed into each other. In fact, Grant, you had asked us a really interesting question, I think a couple of episodes ago. You had the kind of epiphany or something where you realized that a writer you really liked had influenced your work, kind of almost unconsciously. Hang on, door just blew open weirdly. I got to shut it.
Hey, sorry about the Oilers, bro. That was rough,
Oh man. So Ted's not here. Let's talk about hockey and how heartbroken.
He's here.
Mute, mute,
Ted,
mute,
yeah.
mute. I locked the deadbolt, so metaphorically and literally. So anywho, whatever I was saying, everything kind of yeah. But about something that influenced you, without realizing it, And I said, well, I don't think so. I think I definitely am influenced by a lot of writers, and I definitely deliberately, mimic, copy certain techniques and things. But I don't think, unconsciously. But I one of the things I do for my Beowulf stuff is I review medieval literature, like scholarly books, for the Medieval Academy of America's journal. I don't feel like I can really do original scholarship. One, I don't have the chops for that, and 2, I just don't have the time. But I can read other, books fairly knowledgeably and write academic reviews so that specialists can, figure out if they should read that or not. But anyway, so I got on a review assignment. I can't say what it is yet because it hasn't been published yet. But I read, spent several weeks reading this really in-depth book on Beowulf, etc. And it 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 put Beowulf in a context structurally that I never really thought about before. And I had this sort of epiphany, like, oh, like the strophes of Job and its earlier book, Crow Song for the Stricken, which have really unusual structures, which some reviewers have liked, some have mainly been puzzled about. I realized that I think I was at some level structuring those stories the way that medieval poem Beowulf is structured. But it never occurred to me until I read this, scholar writing about the structure. So, really long-winded way of saying, I guess probably I have been influenced by books and things I read without realizing it. But that was really, it was partly thanks to Grant's question, getting me thinking about it, but then also this bit of scholarship I was doing that kind of opened my eyes to some things about my own writing. Brady, you haven't had a chance for a little bit. Does that spark any reactions from you in particular?
Yeah, well, yes, many. Just in listening to the to both of you talk about this, in particular, Grant's notion of how being a little bit more deliberate and thinking about how things all contribute or are part of the world of the writing. But then Ted's metaphor of the constellation, I don't feel quite that way. I feel kind of more schizophrenic, like kind of all over the place. But one thing that Ted was mentioning just lately, and this is due to a colleague I got to know when I was teaching in Ireland, Michael Booth, and he writes about conceptual blending, about how the mind, and he's interested in neuropsychology and how the brain takes in information and how that process feeds into creative activity. And so going back to Ted's point, we don't, like, one of the great things about our minds are the ways that things get drawn together in the creative process. And so it goes a little bit back to Grant, like all those things are part of a bigger creative process, and it's all conceptually blending in the way that our minds evidently work. And so some things we're conscious of, but we are taking in information from all over the world, and there are narrative patterns that, like the sort that Ted just described, that we are all part of, this vast inner world of cognition, and how we get to put things together. I think that's really exciting, how, and we've talked about this, how things become attached to stories, and how in a way stories tell themselves. And Michael's the cognitive theory that he draws on, conceptual blending, helps explain all that. But it's just what Ted just said, in a more intuitive way. But yeah, I'm all over the place, and I'm not comfortable about that.
Yeah, and I think for me, as I've got older, I think I realized, I don't know how to explain this, but there's almost a sense of returning, in that the kind of writing I'm doing now is the kind of writing and storytelling that excited me when I was 9, 10 years old and a teenager. Like, I'm writing crime stories. What were my favorite movies when I was 9 or 10? It was gangster films, with Jimmy Cagney and Humphrey Bogart. And then as I got older, it became Raymond Chandler and detective stories and film noir. I mean, I got an encyclopedic book when I was in my early 20s by Alan Silver and Elizabeth Ward. My goal was to see every one of the films in that book. And so those were just sort of obsessions. And I think there's something about space creating that's like, I'm a city kid. I grew up in a big city, Toronto, and I hated country music, which I do like now, but I hated it. I hated shows like the Beverly Hillbillies and anything to do with a tree, Mayberry, all that crap. I mean, I still don't like the Andy Griffith Show, but and I realized how much space geography has to do with my taste. So I was a guy. I like New York. I like stories set in New York. I like big city locations, And so anyway, that's just some of my thoughts on that. Is space creating the writer, and my that sense of returning. I'm now writing the stuff I think I was supposed to be writing all along, but I wasn't given permission to do so. And now I'm giving myself permission to do so, and it's exciting, and it's shaped also by the other writers I've read, like Bernard Malamud. So I'm a big fan of narrative compression, narrative telling, using that in my crime stories, and then of course Jane Austen, who I have tremendous respect for.
Coming back to Brady's thing about how do we make choices about what we work on and that kind of thing, I feel like I've kind of gone almost full circle here in my own writing life. When I was really young and just, kind of starting off, early, maybe college age, very early 20s, I know I started a bunch of novels and abandoned them after a while. And part of my thinking at the time was, well, am I working on a novel that an agent's going to like, is going to want to represent, or that a publisher, a big time publisher is going to want to publish? And so I was kind of evaluating every project on its marketability, which I had no sense of. I barely have a sense of it now, all these years later. So I would like, well, okay, now I got this other idea, so I'm going to work on that because I think that's the novel. When I finish writing it eventually, that's the one that's going to get an agent and going to get, whatever. But I would keep bopping around and so I'd end up with all these, third written, quarter written, half written manuscripts, because I was always trying to land on the one I thought was going to be the kind of unlock the literary future that I had in mind. But then I eventually decided, if you keep doing that, you're never going to finish anything. So then I had to really get, shoulder to the wheel kind of thing. And then I got into this thing where I would just sort of systematically finishing one novel after another. It might take me 3, 4, 5 years, but I would finish it. Well, I've discovered like the last 3 or 4 years that I'm kind of back to that kind of getting impatient, and I've got this other idea and it's really attractive. And so like, since these little sci-fi things have been picked up and editors have been saying nice things about them, now I'm itching to get back to that sci-fi novel that I abandoned more than a year ago. But now I've got this other historical novel that's like 20. And so I can see myself easily just sort of bouncing back and forth between projects and never finishing anything. So I'm trying to be more focused on, a particular project. But now it's not because I think a literary agent's going to love it or Random House is going to publish it. Now it's more about just my own interests and what I want to be doing and working on and that kind of thing. But I do feel like I need to knuckle down and try to stay the course on this book. And then, when I get it done, hopefully then I can maybe go back to this other project. Boy, it is tempting. I know Stephen King talks about his process, or at least what it was at one point when he was interviewed. Is what his process was. He had like his main thing in the morning that he was working on, the novel he was trying to finish or whatever it was. But then in the afternoon, he would come back, to some just idea that he'd had, just kind of play around with it. And the metaphor he used, it was like in the morning, he was like true to his wife, but in the afternoon, he was kind of fooling around with a mistress a little bit just for fun, and I don't know that I could do that morning and afternoon kind of thing, but I guess I'm kind of doing it with my Monday through Thursday novel writing and Friday translation. So anyway, I don't know if that's a problem for all writers, or if it's just something I'm really kind of going through at this point in my life. I don't know, Brady, do you find yourself having a hard time to stay focused on a particular project, or are you pretty good about keeping your eye on the prize?
I find the problem is because there are so many interesting things. And this is exactly the original question. How to choose? And so I find myself, rather than starting a project, I find myself putting the brakes on. I mean, part of it too is, this goes back to some of the stuff that Grant was talking about. I have this pesky day job. We have these pesky day jobs. They expect us to show up and do certain kinds of things, and they take like big parts of my day. They take big parts of my brain, and so in the time since we've activated, and so I'm gonna be mean here, but in in a affectionate way or a admiring way. And since we began this taping this podcast, Joyce Carol Oates has written a whole novel, 800 pages. Right. And so it's a matter of time. How do you get that time? And that, like, the ideas are there. The time is the hard part. And then this idea of, like, Stephen King, like working in the morning and then working in the afternoon. My brain doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
I'm good from like 7 until about 2. And then after that, like, I can hardly tie my shoes. Like, if I can figure out how to make lunch and, not set the house on fire, like that's the as much firepower as I have left. So I don't know. How
Well,
does Joyce Carol Oates do
Yeah.
it 12 hours a day?
Yeah.
Well, oh, I'm sorry. Just real quickly, Grant. That's the thing I was going to say about Joyce Carol Oates. It's yeah, having that stick to itiveness to write for 10, 11, 12 hours a day. I don't know. I mean, I have more time on my hands, although I've gotten pretty darn busy. I'm not very good at retirement. I'm almost busier now than when I was working full time, but at least it's all things that I like doing. But I spend, the first part of my day writing. So but I feel like an hour and a half if I'm really on a roll of actually composing, and then I stop writing by longhand, and then I turn to my computer and my laptop and I type up what I've just written. I was for a long time, I'd write each morning, and then after the course of a few weeks I'd have just pages and pages and pages. Then I would have to ultimately sit down, and I'm a pretty good typist, but still it was sort of drudgery to sit down and type several pages of notes. It works much better for me if I write for an hour or so and then immediately type up that section, make a few changes while I'm at it, etc. But anyway, a couple hours doing that, and I'm pretty much done for the day. I don't know that I could put 3, 4, 5, 10 Joyce Carol Oates hours into it, even if I totally had the time. Yeah, Grant, I'm guessing you're kind of on a similar boat.
Yeah. I don't know. I think part of writing for me is to respect your own process and not worry about what other people do. I can't write every day. I mean, when I'm on a roll with a novel, I write every day. But right now, I've got Shoot Shine Kill. I've got another novel done. And I need some downtime. And so I'm reading, and that's feeding the engine. So when I sit down to write, I'll be ready to go. But I Springsteen talked about that. He takes time off between projects, and then he goes into a writing mode, and that's kind of how I feel about it. That's what works for me. I'm not suggesting that for all our listeners out there, but find out what works for you, and don't judge yourself harshly if you're not Joyce Carol Oates or you're George Simenon, who wrote, allegedly 5 to 10,000 words a day. I don't know how he did that. Be your own writer and work on your craft, and be proud of what you do and believe in it. And yeah, so every time I hear someone start talking about process, I'm like, oh, I used to beat myself up, and now I'm like, that's not my process. This is my process, and it works for me. So that's my feeling.
Yeah, I teach online, and so I make a lot of videos for my students, and we got this podcast, etc. Well, I always share with my students, stuff. Here's this video. Obviously, if I made it for them, but also I'll give them links to the podcast. A lot of them will. I had this, a student last session or two, very very nice person, but they watched the podcast, and they liked it, but they were like, your videos and your podcast, they would be so much, I don't know, better. I don't know what word I don't think she used better, but so much better, basically, if they had like a theme and some graphics and blah 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 blah. And and this person was a media person, and so that's kind of what they did during the day. They did media stuff. And I'm thinking, you know what? I'm running 12 Winters Press, 12 Winters Journal. I got this podcast going. I'm teaching. I'm doing about all I can, and I think that's what some people don't realize about writers who teach. That what makes us good teachers and makes us qualified to teach writing is that we're writers. And, in my case, also publishing, Grant, obviously editing, etc. And so all those things take time. I'll listen to other podcasts, and yeah, they've got cool themes and they got little graphic things and this going on, audio clips of this, that, and the other. But then at the end of the podcast, they start thanking like 20 people who were involved in making that podcast, sound engineers and researchers and music people and editors. It's me with my Chromebook and Zoom and and that's it. Like 12 Wonders Press, I'm 12 Wonders Press. Obviously I get help from the team of readers for 12 Wonders Journal, which I'm really grateful for. But I feel like I'm doing pretty well as a kind of a one-man band here. And maybe it'd be nice to have a little slicker podcast or something, but I don't know, the content wouldn't be any better. I listened to some kind of slick podcast. It's like, well, what did I really get out of that? I mean, it was kind of cool sounding, but at the end of the 45 minutes or hour or whatever, what have I actually learned from it? So yeah, it's hard to I guess produce that level when you're just kind of a one person army.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I thought we might talk about is the importance of mastering the short form. And since we generally are talking about fiction, I'll just kind of clarify it as saying mastering the short story versus the novel. Several episodes ago, I mentioned that I seem to have a lot of budding writers, students who were turning in like novel sections or something, but it was more like a summary of a novel, which is bopping from one event to the next, very little depth and just, and sort of in-depth description. And I had this other kind of related epiphany. I'm using that word a lot this episode, but I haven't really been teaching creative writing very much. I've been in this MFA program I've been teaching in for 7 or 8 years now, but up until the past year, I've been focused on teaching literature classes, which was my preference. But for the past year, basically, they've asked me to start teaching like both this introductory course for new MFA students and then this thesis course. And then also last year, I taught this advanced creative writing class for undergraduate creative writing majors at a different university. And it seems like everybody is writing novels. And so everything they turn in is like the chapter of a novel. And it's like, and so oftentimes it's like, well, this is chapter 6 of this YA fantasy novel. And, and so it's like you read it, it's like, well, the characters are very well developed or whatever. Is that because the writing is not quite there? Or did we miss that in chapters 1 through 5 somehow? And so I got to thinking, I wonder if these folks who are writing these novels, if they've really written very many short stories. Because I really do think the short story you sort of have to learn to walk well before you can run well, and so we had these conferences the past week or so, and I just out and out asked some of the novel writers, have you written very many short stories? And across the board, each one said, no, not really, and I think that's really hard to try to write, really effective long form fiction if you haven't yet mastered the short story. Because I think basically a novel is a series of linked short stories, basically, whether you call them chapters or sections or whatever. So I don't know, I'm going to stop yammering here. What about that? I guess, do you think that's true, that you have to master the short story before really being able to write a novel effectively? But also, there just aren't that many students reading short stories and writing short stories. Brady, what are your thoughts there?
Oh, well, I would totally agree, Ted. And I know that maybe, and we talk about a lot of different writers, the writers that we admire and that we've read. And so certainly one writer, and I don't know if we're allowed to talk about this person anymore, but we have in our podcast, who is sort of influential in my thinking about the writing life, any kind of writing life, Hemingway. And so you had the idea that to learn how to write, the first professional gig should be as a journalist. And then you wrote short stories, but particularly tight, narrowly focused, super controlled short stories. And then, he eventually, expanded his art and then got back to trying to compression again. And I always took that as a kind of working method, but I hear from folks in the MFA program and creative writers come into contact with that people don't necessarily spend a lot of time writing short fiction anymore because they can't sell them. And then readers don't want to read short story collections, put too much pressure on the reader. And so there seems to be something in the air, in the ether, that really one ought to just write novels. And so I think that the learning some of the craft and the discipline, I mean, certainly in creative writing classes, I think folks are still writing plenty of short stories, but I think the coin of the realm is the novel. I know Grant has way more experience with all of this than I do, so I'll stop yammering.
Yeah, I'm somewhere between the two positions, because there's a way in which I think I love the short story form. Okay, I'm gonna put my cards on the table, and I've written a ton of short stories, but I also realize I didn't start writing short stories till I started a master's program, in which that's what was taught. And so I wanted to be a screenwriter, and I didn't get in. University of British Columbia didn't take me, and I got into Kansas State, and it was poetry or short stories. So there was no talk about doing a novel. It was, and I learned the short story form, and I fell in love with it. And so there's a way in which the way classes are structured, the short story is perfect. You got a beginning, middle, and end. We can talk about character development. Whereas, like you're saying, Ted, you teach. If you're working someone's chapter from now, you can say, well, this isn't, and they say, well, no, I explained that later on in chapter 9. Or, I don't understand why they're making this choice. Oh, that's just a little breadcrumb I'm giving you, and it gets explained in chapter 20. So it's not self-contained. They're a little harder to critique because they're not complete, and we just don't have time to read a whole novel before in a week. And we're trying to get through all these different students' work. So there's a way in which the workshop has generated the creation of more short stories. But then what Brady's saying is absolutely true too. I know there's your first collection can't be a short story collection, is at least what I've heard. So you publish a novel or whatever, and then they might bring out your short story collection later. That's just kind of how the business runs, and it is hard to get collections of short stories with the big presses. The days of the Bernard Malamuds and those, but even Malamud, who was a great practitioner of the short story, wins the Pulitzer Prize for the Fixer, I think it was. So yeah, it's I think we in creative writing classes have made the short story important again, but there are writers. Like I'll go to my grave arguing that Hemingway's a much better short story writer than he is a novelist. I mean, I like Brady's thing about him expanding his craft, but his short stories are masterful. And I find his novels, Old Man the Sea, Farewell to Arms, To Have and Have Not that interesting.
No, I think The Sun Also Rises is where he hit his perfect stride.
Right, and that was
the short story in a somewhat longer form. But For Whom the Bell Tolls, just Two Nice Kids. I'm still only halfway through that book, and I started.
But yeah, I agree with you. Like The Sun Also Rises is a masterpiece. It's like Fitzgerald, Great Gatsby for me, and
for short. Yeah.
Tender is the Night. I mean, those are masterpieces. But and you think it was 1925, 20, it's in there. It's in that period where he's writing all that great stuff in our time and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's kind of my feeling about it. I do feel you can be a novelist without writing short stories. You could study the novel and its forms and but I think there's something about starting smaller and working with language and working with compression and working with the short story form can teach you that thing can translate to novels. So I'm kind of in both. Like for me, it's like they're two different forms. I value both of them. But I think there's a lot novelists can learn by mastering the craft of the short story. But I also think you can be a great novelist without really doing many short stories. And that's if you look back in the past, a lot of people that wrote short stories in the 20s, 30s, 40s, not a lot, a few. It was just to get a quick paycheck while they're working on the novel, right? I mean, how many short stories does Steinbeck write? I mean, I don't see a big fat collection of the collected short stories of John Steinbeck, but I look at his, volume of novels, the short story wasn't necessarily his thing, but he would make a quick buck and then go back to, East of Eden or whatever. So, I guess
Yeah.
I'm in the middle. I'm in the middle on this.
Well, you remind me that Toni Morrison, who's one of my favorites, and I try to teach her as often as I can. She only wrote one short story in her. She claimed, and recitative or whatever, and everything else she wrote was a novel. Now, some of her novels are pretty short, especially the early ones. They're more like novellas. So, I mean, that's a whole nother issue. I mean, you were talking about Hemingway. A Hemingway that I still really love, in fact, I think it's probably my favorite Hemingway, is The Old Man and the Sea. But I still think of that as just a long short story. In fact, it appeared originally in a single issue of Life magazine. So it's not War and Peace by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, it's one of those stories that when I was younger, I related to it in one way. But now that I'm older, I much more relate to Santiago, the old man, than I might have to other elements of the story. Maybe we should. Maybe this is a good segue to our featured story. Unless Brady, would you like to follow up on anything that we just said before we move on to our featured story?
No, not at all. But I will. I'm gonna pull a small Grant here. A Grant kind of move, and I'm going to jump in ahead of Ted in the segue to this story. I just want to say, for the record, that as great as many of the short stories have been that we have read and discussed in our podcast, I think this one, this story is stunning. I think this might be the best. I mean, how does one choose? We've talked about how do we know whether something is good or not. This might be the best thing that we've read. So thanks to Ted for choosing it. Don't know this writer, the Unsung Masters series. I think Ted will tell us some things about it.
I know a little bit about that series just because I've read the Nancy Hale book that's in that collection, Pleiades. I think they give them out to their subscribers or something. But I love this so much that I ordered it last night. I was rereading the story and I'm like, I got to get this.
Same. Yeah, I got online this morning and ordered it. Yeah.
Fantastic, Ted. It's a great story.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, because it's a little longer, and I know we're all kind of busy. So I'm glad that you found it so much to taste. Yeah, this is we're going to talk about a story by Jean Ross Justice, and as Grant's already mentioned, it's part of the Unsung Masters series, and this particular issue, the Justice issue, is edited by Ryan Ballenbach and Kevin Proofer. I hope I'm pronouncing those names correctly. Yeah, and it's a joint effort. It says in the back of the book, this edition of the Unsung Masters is produced as a collaboration among Gulf Coast, Copper Nickel, Pleiades, the Georgia Review, etc. And then I think another Department of English, University of Houston is also credited as producing the book. So talk about a joint effort. But obviously the idea here is that these are authors that they're featuring in this Unsung Masters series who were masters of the craft of fiction, who just did not get the recognition that they deserved in their day for whatever reason. And again, this writer, Jean Ross Justice, she 1924 to 2016, she had a good long life, which is good because a lot of her she only published 3 books and they both were very late in life. So I normally save the bio for like a little later after we get into the story, but let me just go ahead and read a little bit about her. And actually, I got a couple things going on here. So this is what it says in the book, or on the back of the book. Although she began publishing fiction in magazines in the 1950s, Jean Ross Justice's first short story collection, The End of a Good Party, appeared in 2008 when she was 84. It was followed by another collection of stories, Family Feeling, in 2014, and the novel Till My Baby Comes Home, published 2016, and she died in 2019. And the Till My Baby Comes Home, her only novel, was self-published. I learned that at a different site, but really some great credits. She published in the Yale Review, the Antioch Review, Oxford American, Shenandoah, and apparently she lived most of her life in Iowa City, which is another. I thought maybe Grant might have some knowledge of her. She was born and raised in South Carolina and attended the University of South Carolina for a time, but then she ended up marrying Donald Justice, who was a poet in the Iowa Writers Workshop. So she spent most of her adult life in Iowa City. But we're going to talk about, as these guys have already mentioned, a really good story called Double First Cousins. And apparently it was not published in magazines. Its first appearance was in the collection that came out in 2008.
Unbelievable, a story of this quality.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't know if she submitted it, or presumably she had every connection in the world to get it placed. But yeah, it's stunning.
Right. Well, actually, so no, that's fine. So I meant to say that this book, which you guys have apparently ordered, it's pretty cool. It's got an introductory section, which is an interview with her son Nathan, who talks about growing up in a house with a fiction writer and a poet, and what that was like. And then we've got several short stories of hers that are collected here. And then there are some like critical essays, like 4 or 5 of them at the end of the collection, where people kind of reflect on some of her stories, etc. So it's a really cool book. And yeah, absolutely check that out. But again, the story we're looking at is Double First Cousins. And I'll read, as I tend to do, just kind of from the beginning, and then maybe gets a very brief synopsis. And then you guys, I think, are eager to jump in. So this is the beginning of the short story. Twice today, my life was spared. The first close call was at the river bridge when I was making a left turn. I'd misjudged the speed of the oncoming car and was barely out of the way in time. He blasted me with the horn. The sound spread out on the air, flat and metallic. I had a brief palpitation of feeling like a small bicyclist deep in my chest, pedaling too fast, whirling away. If there'd been a crash, I'd have to said to the police, my fault, all my fault. I'm an old woman driving a long burgundy car, one of those powerful gas guzzlers, the last car my husband Norris picked out. That deep, rich hum he liked is worn out. The engine has come to have an unhealthy, excitable sound. All right, so this is a reflective narrator, and Marguerite is her name. And most of the story is about, she grew up with this cousin, Gwen, who I think is a little bit older, but they were so close in age and so close geographically that they grew up pretty much as sisters. Gwen went off and got married pretty young to a guy named Kip. And then Gwen is diagnosed with an illness, although there's some question about whether the diagnosis is accurate or not. But she's sickly much of the time, doesn't have a lot of energy, et cetera, et cetera. And so Marguerite comes to live with Kip and Gwen. And pretty clearly, Marguerite develops this huge crush on Kip, her cousin-in-law, basically. And Gwen doesn't seem to appreciate Kip's finer points. And so there's this kind of tension in this house. And so that's a big part of the story. But then we also, because it's a reflective narrator and Marguerite is now an old woman kind of looking back, we also get, interspersed some things that have happened in the intervening years, and we kind of go back and forth in time. But as these guys have mentioned, it's just a beautiful story. It reads almost like a novel in terms of its depth and just the images and so forth. So I'm going to stop right there. And Brady, let me come back to you, since you particularly were so kind of overwhelmed by the story.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. Over the course of our podcast, we've had occasion to speak about the writers that we admire, the folks that we read. And and we've talked about genre writers, and lately I've been reading some Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I'm almost always in the background reading an Agatha Christie. Grant was talking about, sort of cycling back to the things that we like. And so we talked about Zora Neale Hurston, Maybe mentioned Anne Petrie, Toni Morrison, Hemingway, Joyce Carol Oates. Who comes to mind in this story by Jean Ross Justice is Alice Munro. Like I don't know who else. Like to get the scope of lives in a short story, it's only 20 pages, but to get a sense of the scope and some of the devastating and quietly experienced losses and emotions in a life across a lifetime, in community, with friends, with family. I don't think maybe Justice is quite as hard edged in the presentation of character. You know, the way that Munro really sort of sees into our contradictions and our complexities. But Justice, there's a sympathy for these characters and a kind of heartbreaking way of exploring the internal experiences and the problem of being alive and having a heart. I think this story, the writer that most came to mind, certainly Alice Munro.
Yeah. And I think because one of the brilliant tour de forces of it is you use the word crushed, and having a crush and saying you have a crush on someone is a safe way of talking about the complexities of human emotions, because it's a way of saying, well, we didn't do anything untoward, we didn't have sex. I mean, if you have a crush on someone, it sort of implies a kind of safety net, but it belies to still have a crush. There's desire, there's an intimacy there. It's not necessarily unrequited. It could be two people just enjoy each other's company, and there's a free genre there. And there's a way in which this narrator in this story is withholding a lot of information, or hasn't quite figured out everything. Like she even says at one point, well, that's my privilege. And I'm like, yeah, sweetheart, this is the way you're telling the story, is your privilege, and you're not telling us everything. And I love that about this piece. And I don't know if she's totally come to terms with just exactly how she feels about Kip. There's definitely sexual desire there. And there's this wonderful moment where it's Mrs. Treadway is like, you got to go to college, go. And the go is double voiced. It's not just.
Yeah, this is Kip's mom, by the way, Mrs. Treadway.
Yeah. And it's go to, and it's like, go because you're going to miss out on your future and on life, but also go because maybe it's not a good thing to have you hanging around these other two people, this husband and wife team. And the description of the plinking, I remember that word plink, of the ping pong ball as they're playing, table tennis, and the way she converses with Kip. There's just so much layers there. And I was blown away by the doubling, like the fact that there's a moment where Gwen talks about this other boy that was a little bit self-absorbed, but she went to some kind of concert, and the choir wore red, and her wedding was in red, and she got this doubling of the red, and she starts to wonder, if I would have married that boy instead of Kip, my life would have been different. Maybe I wouldn't have got multiple sclerosis or whatever condition she has. Things would have worked out better for me. And then we got this narrator that's going on and on about Kip, but I know nothing about Norris. And it's almost like her marriage to Norris is a bit like Gwen's marriage to Kip, whereas there's this other man in both of their lives that was maybe a little more impactful in some ways. So it's so dense and so rich and poignant. And then the other thing that I admired, it's an old trick that I've seen Malama do, I've seen Cheever do it, where you begin the story and you say there's two things and you withhold one of them. So we have the near car, and then it's not till we get to the very end. And again, that sense, it seems to be a theme of mine today, the sense of returning. And so we get this sort of encapsulated narrative between these two bookended halves, and then we get the second part of, being spared. So yeah, just brilliantly constructed story. Absolutely.
I know, Ted, I'm not giving you a chance to speak. I'm just going to jump in. one of the reactions, and this goes along, I think, maybe with some of the things that Grant has been saying, in some of the stories that we've read, though we certainly like them, we kind of wanted them to move along. This story, not at all. It is so perfectly paced, and it ends with or part of the denouement of the story, of the study of character, is this exchange between Gwen, Marguerite, late in life, is just absolutely devastating. But the story is tailored to bring us to that
Yeah.
moment and to other moments. And there wasn't like there. I didn't want this to end. How often, right? Do we have that experience? We can be enjoying something, but come on, move it along there, folks. This one, just perfect. Sorry, Ted. Can't help myself.
No, that's great. I hoped that you guys would like this. I always have that, well, I hope they like it. It's not going to be too much of a chore to read this one, but it is very traditional. And oftentimes, Brady and I in particular tend to really like the more experimental stuff. And so sometimes I pick out a story. I think, oh, this is kind of for Brady. And sometimes I pick out this one. I thought this is going to be Grant's kind of story. He's a little bit more classical, traditional in his storytelling. But it's so good that I think anyone who likes narrative appreciates narrative. Yeah, and you talked about the pacing, and I'll just kind of point out for listeners that it's interesting because the pacing is just kind of perfect throughout, but yet it's made up of like these sections, some of which are pretty long. They're 3, 4, 5, 6 pages, uninterrupted, scene description, etc. And then others are like really short, just 2, 3, 4 sentences, and then variations in between. And so even though there's this sort of variation of sort of, I don't know, vignette, that's not even quite the right word, but section size, it doesn't like interrupt sort of the rhythm of the pace of the narrative. It just all goes kind of beautifully along here. And then I'll kind of get back to, and I'd have to read it a few more times to really wrap my head around this. I was reading again this morning and was kind of particularly amazed by this, and Grant kind of brought it up. It's a first person narrator. And so presumably, the narrator ought to be completely privy to her own ideas and thoughts and recollections. But yet there's a lot in this story that seems to be sort of hinted at, but it's not like the author narrator is being coy with us, the reader. It's almost more like she's kind of being coy with herself. She's not ready to totally embrace the past as it may have been, and then there's this interesting thing that happens where, in the beginning, Kip seems like kind of this idealized guy. He goes to work, he comes home, he comes in the house, everything's just more interesting, and he's very friendly, and he's very sympathetic to his ailing wife. And, he seems like just a really great guy. But then by the end, we're starting to get some information where that is called into question. Maybe he did have kind of a tendency to stray a little bit. And then the question is, well, did he stray with Marguerite? And so even though we're getting all this information directly from the person who lived it, there's still all of these question marks. And like I said, it's not clear if they're even question marks to the narrator herself.
Yeah, I agree. And it's coming back to Hemingway, who it's one of my favorite writers, major influence, and him and Raymond Carver in terms of the power of the unsaid. There is so much repression in this story, so much unsaid in this story, and part of it is by choice, and sometimes it's by I don't know how to explain. Like what Gwen is going through is what I see a lot of my young writers. They write about these characters that are kind of in a driftless area. Like, what's their future going to be? Like, opportunities seem closed off. Houses are so expensive. To own your own. Like the American dream has been sort of, I think, thrown into question in the last 10, 20 years. And I just see the generation of kids that are coming out of my program having that sense of loss. And here we are, the story that seems to have the Depression as a background. There's also a sense of loss and sort of proto-feminism. You've got the Gwen wondering about her future. And it reminds me, my mom wrote a poem. I think I shared this with you guys during a broadcast. She took some creative writing classes in the late 60s. And I remember her sharing stuff with us at the dinner table. And she wrote a poem. And the poem was, every day I repeat and repeat and repeat. And that was it. And what a feminist statement. And that's the way I kind of feel about Gwen. Yes, there's all that stuff maybe going on with her husband and and Marguerite, but there's also the sense of why did I get married? And this is what marriage is, and I'm freaking bored. I mean, there's so much questioning of self-actualization. And then even Marguerite sort of shares a little bit about that too. Why did I get married? I can't remember the name of her husband, Norris. We were like a couple of old people before we even got married. And so and it just seems like life's not all that satisfying. You grow up reading all these books, and she mentions Agatha Christie, and you have this sort of glamorized view of things. And then after high school and college, this is it. This is it. I mean, uh, it's a wonderful layer of the unsaid and of repression and of disappointment. It's sort of it's threaded throughout the piece, I think.
Yeah,
one of the-
yeah.
Oh.
Go ahead, Brady.
Well, just to build on what Grant's saying, one of the things I admire most about this is I don't think we always know. I think what this story is really great about is we don't really even know what's going on in our lives. We don't really always know why we are doing what we're doing, or the sort of mix of emotion and desire. Are these things subject to our will, or do they have lives apart from us, and they just happen to be inside of us and be us? And so there's this sort of mysteriousness about life, I think, that this story captures so quietly. And just to take a little step back, and maybe this is cruel or not the right way to think about these things, but this story is really smart. And it's really thoughtful, and so much of what is out there to be consumed is just as dumb as can be. It's like just sort of shockingly dumb and awful and thoughtless. So to find something, to trip, in this case, thanks to Ted's agency, to trip across something so good, so thoughtful, so true, I think, to the mysteriousness of life and the human heart, and how well we even know ourselves. Yeah. Anyone listening to this podcast, go get this, turn off your damn TV, put down your phone, read this.
Yeah. You said it so well, Brady. I mean, it is an exploration of the human heart. And as human beings, there are so many choices we make, or choices we think we're making, but we're not in control of everything. We don't understand everything. There's so sometimes I don't feel like I understand anything. And I love the complexity of the care. I think I don't think she's just and I appreciate you. I think, Ted, you said being coy. She's not being coy, and I know that's not what you're saying. I think she doesn't, and it's not she's being dishonest. She's trying to unpack it and doesn't quite understand it all, and is trying her best. But then there's also this element of privacy. It kind of reminds me of like in Saving Private Ryan, where Tom Hanks says, "No, that is just for me." He doesn't want to talk about his wife to his other, so that's his own private thoughts. And that's a nice moment with the reader where she's saying, "No, that's my privilege to stand on," and I respect that. So anyway, it's a very cool story, and smart is the perfect word for it.
Well, your metaphor about unpacking, I mean, that kind of sparked for me this image of someone who's opening a suitcase or a briefcase or something, and they start to get a little glance inside, and they quickly shut it because they kind of know what's in there, but they don't want to fully deal with it or whatever. Or it's sort of like getting a letter or an email nowadays, and you want to know what it says. Did you get the job? Did you get the whatever? But yet you're a little afraid to find out too. So you kind of look at it, but you kind of don't. And I think there's that kind of sense throughout much of the story as well. But some of the descriptions are just so vibrant, but yet they're concise. And I was thinking about this too, because oftentimes newer writers, when they introduce a character, will feel duty bound to give us like a very detailed physical description of the character. They've got brown hair and it's shoulder length, and they've got this kind of top on, and they're wearing these kind of earrings. And I think they feel like, well, we have to give the reader a very clear visual picture of this person so they can visualize the scene or whatever. But that isn't really how reading and narrative works. Just little teeny bits, and then the reader will kind of they will expand on that. They'll visualize whoever they're going to visualize. I love this description of Mrs. Treadway, and again, this is Kip's mother, who keeps popping up to sort of remind Marguerite that she needs to get the hell out of there. But it says, Mrs. Treadway had a smooth, plump face and sat with her legs stretched out before her, her ankles crossed. She gave off several sweet scents at once. Just a few words. I mean, and so if I had to draw Mrs. Treadway, I got quite sure what I would draw, but yet it just captures her essence, her persona so perfectly. And we get those little descriptions throughout. And sometimes it's the architecture, like the house that Gwen and Kip live in, which obviously Marguerite, that's part of the whole fantasy. She loves this house down by the river, and she describes its tall columns, and I keep thinking of Faulkner's house, in Oxford, Mississippi, which I visited once, but it's got those long columns in front, and we don't get any other description of the house. We don't what it looks like beyond that, but yet it just captures the romantic idea of this home in South Carolina or one of the Carolinas or whatever. So just this light touch with description, but yet it just hits home perfectly. I don't know, Grant, how do you talk to your budding students about description? And do you have students who seem to want to go overboard in terms of giving every little detail?
Yeah, they go into the Dickensian pause, as I call it, where it's like a catalog of all the and I'm like, we don't need all of this, less could be more. And I talk a lot about that with narrative telling, because we don't need to show everything. I don't need to see everything that's in the room. Like, pick your spots. It's not important what the scents were. I don't need to know, oh, she was wearing sandalwood perfume and there was a mix of apples. And it was pretty obvious to me, Watson, that she's a smoker, because I could smell, like, who cares? Like, the scents, plural, perfect. There's a moment in Malamud where he's describing a teacher talking to a student, and he doesn't go into, the problem here with your paragraphing is, point last construction. You don't know how to do that. And you split your subjects and verbs with a comma, blah, blah. Like, it just says something about went over her paper with her. And it's like, that's all I need to know. I don't need specifics there. And it's interesting that Pat, I mean, I just me because I read so much crime stuff, but it reminds me of the kinds of description that are in Earl Stanley Gardner. There's sort of he describes Paul Drake. I've been reading The Case of the Careless Kitten, and he describes Paul Drake is sitting sideways in a chair with kind of his legs up over the arm. And there's just something about that description. It's so brief, but you just get this idea of someone who's at home in Perry Mason's office. He comes in and he just has this relaxed way of sitting. And there's something about the way she's sitting with those ankles crossed that just speaks volumes. It's just a nice, right touch. I mean, it's great, but it's the kind of thing the rest of it reads like literary fiction, but there are these little moments where I can see the influence of Christie and other writers in terms of those brief little descriptions that develop personas of characters, like you were saying, Ted.
Yeah. Well, Brady, in your novel that's going to be coming out, I hope pretty darn soon here.
Yes, me too.
And that's not a jibe because you haven't got the proofs back to me yet, but unless it's subconscious. But anyway, it's in first person, pretty much the entire novel, and so you've got that dilemma of how does the first person narrator describe themselves? I mean, that even a little bit is sometimes very awkward. So I don't know, how do you think about description, and how did you handle it, especially via a first person narrator for an entire novel, and several first person narrators?
Yeah, well, it's complicated in the novel too, because everyone keeps changing shape. Right, like some people are short at some parts of the novel, other parts of the novel they're tall, and sometimes they have tiny hands, and sometimes they have big claws. And so I guess I got around it that way by just constantly changing everybody up. But it's really curious, because I tend to over describe. I think I would imagine from disagree with Grant. Like I love descriptions, and I'm always puzzled when I read just reader reviews of, say, get online and what are people saying about Agatha Christie, say, and they go, oh, I love her descriptions, of Egypt. And so I read recently Death on the Nile. There's no descriptions of Egypt. There's no descriptions. There's no character. Like everybody's just a name and some, piece of clothing and some, a bad motive in life. Like we don't know anything about anybody. And then they talk about how psychological her books are. What? So, yeah, I myself tend to err and, maybe pay a price for this. Yeah, I like more detailed descriptions. And so Grant would be saying, I imagine, and I'm just projecting because Grant has not said this because he's too kind, perhaps. But like, dude, cut it out, move things along. I don't. Yeah.
Hey man, that's okay. I mean, writing contains multitudes. You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
The world of fiction. So,
yeah, and I like those, huge shaggy books, Tristram Shandy, Moby Dick, Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Like some of those works, like there's no such thing as less, right? It's almost always more.
Well,
Yeah,
in some cases, as you guys well know, those writers of that time period were getting paid literally per word. So if
Dickens.
they could spend 500 words describing someone's hat, that was just more coin in their pocket. So that's Henry James and Dickens and all those characters. A half penny per word or some ridiculous formula like that. They were paid.
Hey penny, I believe they say.
yeah. And the thing I was going to say, Ted, on the flip side of that is, as someone who writes primarily crime stories now and really loves plot, I mean, that's to me really, really important in the cleverness of a plot. But I'm limited by all these magazines I send to. They only want, 1,500 words, 3,000 words, 45. So I'm constantly having to make choices. And I think it's influenced my craft to the point of compression to shorter descriptions, but I want them to be poetic. I want them to be memorable, like hers are in the short story that we've read for this podcast. So there is a way in which the market shapes the writer, and I think we just have to be honest about that. In the past, you got paid per word. Now I feel like I'm trying to take a bigger story and get it shorter so I can get it into various markets. But there's a call for a flash fiction, sudden fiction story, and they say 1,500 words or less. They mean 1,500 words. I can't send them a 2,000 word story. They're not going to take it. So
and we're not writing a short story so we can get a little bit of cash so we can get back to East of Eden, right? Like I mean, who among us is getting rich? I mean, Ted's driving a Lamborghini on the proceeds, Grant. The sales of our works. We are not getting rich, but Ted, you can tell, just look at the number of books behind him. I've got like 3. Ted's got like 100.
Yeah, that's me, Mr. Moneybags. So. Well, unfortunately, we probably want to start to wrap this up. I've got a whole other thing that I wanted to get into, but we'll save that for July. So unless you guys have any final thoughts on this particular story or just final thoughts in general, let me kick it back to you guys for a second. Grant, any words of wisdom here at the end?
Yeah, could you repeat for our listeners out there in case they don't rewind the name of the writer? Because I really want people to track her. I love this series. Like, I didn't know who Nancy Hale was, and I read the collection of her stories, and I was blown away by and now I'm blown away by this. And I can hardly wait for this collection to arrive on my doorstep. So, if you're a practitioner,
it's Jean Ross Justice on the life and work of an American master, and it's part of the Unsung Masters series, and it's readily available, on Amazon, etc. And just while we're on it, I was thought about doing this anyway. It's not a super long list, but here are some of the other writers that they have done as of this particular publication. Shrila Ray, Wendy Batten, Battin, Laura Hershey, Adelaide Cropsey, I think, Belle Turnbull, Beatrice Hastings, Catherine Breese Davis, Francis with an IS, Jans perhaps, Russell Atkins, Nancy Hale, Tamara Ryuichi, and Dustin Thompson and Laura Jensen. A lot of them are women writers, I believe, and that probably contributes to their unsungness, unfortunately. They probably didn't get the attention they deserved in their own lifetime. But anyway, yeah, great series. I got a copy because I had subscribed to Gulf Coast, and that was kind of a bonus thing that I got. And that happens actually with some regularity. If you subscribe to a literary journal, a lot of them are doing kind of special projects, publishing little, novellas or chapbooks or something, and you'll get a copy of that along with your subscription, which is super cool too. So yeah. So definitely track that down. Brady, any final?
Well,
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Ted, I mentioned Pleiades earlier, and I know they do a similar thing with that, but I just want to bring back. We talked earlier about being sort of academics and writers and that idea of criticism. And then to me, this is cultural recovery, which is something I learned on the academic side of things, of finding movies that have been underappreciated, comic book artists that have been underappreciated. And here's, a list of women writers who were underappreciated, many of them in their lifetimes. And so there's a way in which those two things are coming together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Brady, final thought?
Yeah, Gene Ross Justice. I mean, I haven't received the book yet, but if the other stories are anywhere near as good as this story alone is worth the price of admission. So definitely check out Justice's work. And a little bit even older than Penelope Fitzgerald, right? Like in her 80s when she starts publishing. And then just to cycle way back to the beginning of the podcast and sort of been reflecting on this in the back of my mind as we've been talking about the story and other matters. This matter of how do you choose, right? Like have all these ideas, but kind of.
Oh, shoot.
Brady's frozen on us there.
Back.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Go with your passion. Choose the project that you have some strong commitment to. Yeah. Okay. I'll stop talking.
No, that's a great point. I mean, and that's what I try to tell my students every semester, even in, the critical classes, pick something that you care about and are passionate about, and you're going to write a better term paper, don't just try to please me. Like, what are things that are my passions? What are your passions? I want to hear your authentic voice, and I want to hear what you're excited about. So, yeah.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, guys. This was another great episode as far as I'm concerned. Hopefully some of our listeners will feel the same way. So yeah, Brady, I've got a new cover concept I'm going to share with you. So be open-minded. I know you've kind of got an idea for the cover, and I like it. I like the cover idea that you got. And Grant, we need to start thinking about cover art for your new book. That's the one really big question mark. We've got the first chapter typeset, and I don't think it'll take us too long to get the thing together once we get on that track. But the cover right now is a complete mystery. So give some thought to that, and we'll be in touch, obviously individually down the road here. All right, guys.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, and thanks, listeners.